Rick and Morty has been living inside its audience's heads for over a decade. A cartoon about a drunk grandfather and his nervous grandson somehow became one of the most obsessively analyzed pieces of television ever made. Theories, breakdowns, threads that ran for years. A fandom that treated an animated comedy like a crime scene, but underneath all of that, someone kept leaving evidence in plain sight. A ticket number, a flask, a phrase nobody understood until 5 seasons later, and an audience that found all of it. Welcome to Ricktopus. If long-form analysis like this is your thing, subscribing is free, and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. The Theory Factory. Something unusual happened with Rick and Morty in its first few seasons that does not happen with most television. The audience started solving it. Across message boards, video essays, and comment threads, fans began treating the show less like entertainment to be watched and more like evidence to be examined. A crime scene where every prop and throwaway line and background detail was a clue pointing towards something the writers had already decided but had not yet agreed to tell anyone. Most shows generate fan theories as a byproduct, the way a campfire generates sparks. Rick and Morty generated them as if the whole thing had been designed as a puzzle, and the peculiar truth is that for large stretches of it, it had been. The show was built to reward close attention, seeded with details that would only make sense years after they were planted, and the audience responded by paying the closest possible attention to everything. To understand why the fan theory culture around Rick and Morty became so dense and so unusually accurate, it helps to start with what kind of show it actually is, because the surface answer is not the full one. On the surface, it is an adult animated comedy about a genius grandfather and his awkward grandson traveling through alien dimensions. That version of the show is funny and well-made and would have been fine on its own. The deeper version runs underneath, a serialized mythology built out of fragments, a story about grief and abandonment, and the cost of a certain kind of intelligence, stitched together across years of ostensibly standalone episodes. The show kept insisting, especially in its early seasons, that it did not care about continuity, that each episode was its own thing, that the audience should not expect threads to get picked up. The show was lying, and the audience knew it, and that tension between the denial and the evidence on screen is the engine that powered every major fan theory the series ever generated. Dan Harmon, one of the two creators, has a well-documented theory of story structure that he applies to nearly everything he works on, a circular model built around a character needing something, leaving the familiar world to get it, finding it at some cost, and returning changed. He applied this model to Rick and Morty at every level, to individual episodes, to season arcs, and to the long run of the series as a whole. Harmon is also famously open about his working methods, which means that a section of the fandom that paid attention to his public conversations about craft could partially reverse engineer what the show was planning by understanding what its creator believed a story should do. This gave the most attentive segment of the audience a structural map of the series on top of the textual one, a second layer of evidence, and the theories that drew on both layers were consistently closer to the truth than the ones that drew on only the surface. The other creator, Justin Roiland, was more interested in improvisation and absurdism, and his influence pushed the show toward a looser, more chaotic energy that sometimes directly contradicted Harmon's structural discipline. The tension between those two approaches is itself part of why the theories were hard to verify, because the show genuinely had two competing impulses, one toward long-planned mythology and one toward willful incoherence, and any given episode could be doing either or both at once. A background detail that looked like a planted clue might have been exactly that, or it might have been a joke that no one remembered later, and distinguishing between the two from the outside was often impossible. The fan community responded to this ambiguity by treating everything as potentially significant, which produced an enormous volume of theories of wildly varying quality, and which also, in the cases where the detail was genuinely planted, produced theories that were right years before anyone on the show confirmed them. What made the theories unusually accurate was also something more structural. Rick and Morty was a show about a multiverse, and the rules of that multiverse were spelled out early and carefully. Once the audience understood that there were infinite parallel universes, each with its own version of every character, and that the show's own characters moved between them regularly, the logical implications of those rules could be worked out in advance. If a Rick exists who abandoned his family for 20 years, there must be a dimension whose Rick stayed. If a Morty traveling with the Rickest Rick would have to be unusually strange in his own right, what does that imply about his origins? If the portal gun only opens green portals and a yellow portal appears at the end of a major season, what does the color difference mean? These were not intuitive leaps, they were logical deductions from established premises, and the show had established those premises clearly enough that a careful viewer could follow the logic wherever it led. The community that built the theories was also, by the time the show became a cultural phenomenon around its third season, extremely large. Rick and Morty premiered in 2013 on Adult Swim, to modest numbers, and grew steadily through its first 2 seasons, before exploding into mainstream visibility during the run of Season 3 in 2017. By that point, the fandom was operating on a scale that allowed for genuine collective intelligence, with thousands of viewers effectively cross-referencing the entire run of the show simultaneously, catching contradictions and patterns that no individual viewer would likely spot alone. The ticket number in the Jerry Baree that did not match the established dimension designation, the baby Morty memory that contradicted the established timeline of Rick's absence, the first mention of the Central Finite Curve dropped casually by a council member in a throwaway line that the writers later said they had always planned to use. All of these were caught by the community functioning as a distributed close reading machine, logging every anomaly and comparing notes. The platform dynamics of that era shaped what kinds of theories got made. YouTube had matured enough to support long-form video essays, and the Rick and Morty theory video became its own genre, with creators developing loyal followings specifically for their ability to generate and test hypotheses about the show. Reddit hosted dedicated communities that functioned like academic seminars, with threads cross-referencing episodes in granular detail and users citing specific timestamps the way a literary scholar might cite page numbers. The show's writers were aware of this scrutiny, and the response was complicated. Some creators confirmed later that fan theories had been close enough to the truth that they had deliberately obscured plot points to prevent the audience from figuring them out ahead of time, which is a remarkable thing to say about an animated comedy. The fan theorists were not just watching the show, they were, in some operational sense, in a race with the writers to see who could get to the ending first. Several theories achieved a kind of canonical status within the fandom before the show confirmed or denied them, theories that became the accepted explanation for anomalies in the text, even among viewers who had not read the original posts. The theory that the Morty traveling with Rick C-137 was not his original Morty circulated so widely that it became many viewers' default assumption about the show, coloring how they read the relationship between the two central characters for years before the show gave its own account. The theory that the multiverse Rick navigated was not truly infinite, but was instead a curated selection of realities chosen to guarantee his supremacy was debated across the fandom for seasons before the season 5 finale confirmed it in explicit terms and gave it a name. These were not fringe positions. They were mainstream understandings of the show, held by a substantial portion of the audience. And in both cases, the show eventually revealed that the mainstream understanding had been essentially correct. Not every theory landed cleanly. For every prediction that proved accurate, there were dozens that collapsed on contact with later episodes. The artifacts of a community reading too hard into details that turned out to be jokes or continuity errors rather than planted clues. The theory that Rick was actually Morty from the future, traveling back in time and aging into his grandfather's role, accumulated a small devoted following based on their shared stutter and similar head shapes, and the creators dismissed it explicitly by saying they found time travel as a narrative device too limiting to want to use it seriously. The theory that the alien simulation in the first season episode with the Zagarians never actually ended, and that every episode after it takes place inside a nested illusion, was intriguing as a reading of the text, but ultimately could not survive the accumulated weight of the mythology the show kept building, which treated its events as having real and lasting consequences. The show was happy to play with simulation as a theme, but it was not secretly a simulation story. What these failed theories reveal is just as interesting as what the successful ones reveal, because the failures tend to cluster around a specific kind of mistake. The theories that got it wrong usually took the show's own absurdism at face value, treating the weirder and more nihilistic implications of its premise as the actual destination, when in fact the series was consistently using its weirdest premises as the frame for a more conventional story about family and grief and the difficulty of being a person. The audience members who predicted the show most accurately were generally the ones who understood that underneath the interdimensional chaos, Rick and Morty was a story about a man who lost someone and spent his life organizing the entire universe so that the loss could never reach him again, and that all its most elaborate conceits, the Citadel, the Curve, the Revenge Mission, the decoys, were that one emotional fact scaled to cosmic size. The creators noticed this, and the record of their public responses to fan theories is its own fascinating document. Harmon, in particular, was candid about the show's mythology in ways that confirmed some theories and quietly redirected others, and he acknowledged in interviews that certain fan readings had understood the show's intentions better than he might have expected. The relationship between the writers and the fan theorists was not adversarial exactly, but it was not entirely comfortable either, because a show that had built its reputation partly on narrative surprises had to reckon with an audience sharp enough to anticipate those surprises years in advance. The response in some cases was to hide the evidence more carefully, to bury the meaningful details deeper in the background, to make the planted clues harder to distinguish from the noise. The show became in some respects harder to theorize about in its later seasons precisely because it had learned from how well the early theorizing had gone. There is also a cultural dimension to why these theories mattered as much as they did, beyond the simple pleasure of being right about a television show. Rick and Morty attracted an audience that was, in broad terms, unusually invested in the idea of intelligence as an identity. People who related to the experience of feeling like the smartest person in the room and being unsure whether that was an advantage or a curse. The fan theory culture around the show was partly an expression of that identification, a community of people who felt that close attention and careful reasoning could unlock truths that casual viewers missed, and who found in the exercise a version of the same pleasure the show promised, the pleasure of seeing through the surface to the structure underneath. When the theories were right, it confirmed something the audience wanted to believe about themselves. When they were wrong, the show had essentially outwitted them on their own terms, which was, in the logic of Rick and Morty, a more flattering defeat than being right would have been. The show understood this dynamic and played with it. The fourth season episode about the talking cat, which ends with Rick mind-scanning the animal and then refusing to share what he found, is openly a commentary on fan theory culture, a meta-joke about the experience of demanding a satisfying explanation for every detail and being told that sometimes there is no explanation, or that the explanation would not be worth having. The episode where the family is trapped inside a story train and has to reason about narrative structure as though it were physics is another version of the same self-awareness, a show watching its own audience analyze it and deciding to make the analysis part of the text. Rick and Morty kept folding its own fan culture back into itself, which only intensified the theorizing by making the theorists feel that they were, in some sense, characters in the show they were trying to decode. All of this means that walking through the major fan theories of Rick and Morty is not simply a matter of listing what fans guessed and scoring the guesses. It is an act of reading the show twice simultaneously, once for what it says and once for what the audience heard, and noticing the places where those two readings converge, because in those places something unusual happened. A piece of popular fiction managed to build a mythology careful enough that its audience could partially predict it through reasoning alone, and it left enough honest evidence that the predictions were not simply lucky. The theories that follow are the most significant ones, the ones that captured something real about the show, and the ones that failed most instructively, laid out in the order they matter most to understanding what Rick and Morty was actually building across its long and strange run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first section set the stage, a fandom that treated a cartoon as a crime scene and was right more often than any show should allow. Next, the focus turns to the theory that dominated the conversation longer than any other, the question of who Evil Morty really is, where he came from, and what the show eventually told us when it finally answered. Section 2. The Evil Morty Origin Theories. Few characters in animated television have generated as much sustained theorizing as the figure who first appeared at the end of a Season 1 episode, wearing a black eye patch and saying almost nothing. Evil Morty arrived in the final moments of close Rick counters of the Rick kind, having spent the entire episode hiding behind a version of Rick he was controlling through a device implanted in his skull, and the reveal lasted roughly 30 seconds before the credits rolled. Those 30 seconds launched years of some of the most elaborate and attentive fan theorizing the show ever inspired, and the reason they did is that the reveal told the audience almost nothing while implying almost everything. A Morty, the species the show had established as passive and intellectually limited by design, was not only operating independently, but had orchestrated an elaborate plot to frame Rick C-137 for murder. The dissonance between what Mortys were supposed to be capable of and what this one had clearly done was the crack the theories poured into. The first wave of theories arrived within days of the episode airing, and they clustered around the most obvious question the ending raised, which was how a Morty had become capable of this. The answer the fandom converged on earliest was also the one that ultimately came closest to what the show eventually confirmed, though it took several more years and a great deal of additional evidence to develop it into anything like a complete picture. The simplest version of the early theory held that Evil Morty was Rick C-137's original Morty, the grandson who had traveled with him before the series began, who had been abandoned or betrayed or simply discarded, and who had spent the intervening time building toward revenge. The evidence supporting this reading was thin in the first season, but pointed, because the episode that introduced Evil Morty also showed the audience a memory from Rick's mind that should not have existed. Rick had supposedly been absent from Beth's family for 20 years before the series began, which meant he could not have been present for Morty's infancy, and yet the memory machine scanning his brain turned up images of him with a baby Morty, cradling the child with what looked like genuine tenderness. The memory was there, it was clearly emotional for him, and it had no clean explanation within the established backstory. The fandom treated this detail as load-bearing from the start. If Rick had memories of a baby Morty, he had known a Morty before the series began. If he had known a Morty before the series began, the current Morty might not be his first. If the current Morty was not his first, what happened to the original? The theory that Evil Morty was the answer to that last question was elegant because it solved multiple problems at once. It explained Evil Morty's capabilities, since a Morty raised from infancy by the Rickest Rick would have been exposed to an enormous amount of knowledge and would have have developed in ways other Mortys never had. It explained his specific hostility toward Rick C-137, since the abandonment of a child who had been that close to a parent figure would be a credible enough wound to organize a whole revenge campaign around. And it explained why the memory scan in that episode showed Rick becoming visibly emotional at the sight of baby Morty, since the implication would be that the child in the memory was the one who had grown into his greatest enemy. The theory accumulated supporting details across subsequent seasons. In Get Swifty, a photograph visible in Bird Person's home shows Rick holding an infant Morty, the image casual enough to suggest it was taken by someone who knew both of them well, and some theorists pointed to the photo as evidence that whatever relationship Rick had with the original Morty predated even the series proper. The Rick-Lantis mix-up in Season 3 added another layer, because the episode followed evil Morty's rise to the presidency of the Citadel in exhaustive detail and made clear that his plan had been running for far longer than a single season, that he had been playing a game against the entire institution of the Ricks for years, possibly from the moment he was first introduced. A Morty patient and intelligent enough to run that kind of long game had to have started from somewhere unusual, and the original Morty theory remained the most coherent explanation the fandom had. What the theory could not account for, and what caused it to splinter into several competing variants across the middle seasons, was the question of motivation. The plain version held that evil Morty was angry at Rick C-137 for abandoning him, but the show's own portrayal of evil Morty did not quite fit the profile of a scorned child seeking personal revenge. His targets were too broad. He was not primarily trying to hurt Rick C-137. He was trying to dismantle the entire Citadel and the system it represented. His monologue in the Rick-Lantis mix-up, delivered quietly in the moments after he secured the presidency, was not the speech of a boy taking revenge on his grandfather. It was the speech of a prisoner who had finally gotten close enough to the lock to pick it. This observation sent some theorists in a different direction, toward the idea that evil Morty's origin was less about personal betrayal and more about ideological understanding, that he had simply seen clearly what the Citadel was and what the relationship between Rick's and Morty's actually involved, and had decided to burn the whole thing down rather than live inside it. A darker variant of the original Morty theory developed around this reading. Several users in online communities argued that evil Morty's intelligence was not simply the product of spending time with Rick, but might have been deliberately enhanced, that Rick C-137 had raised a Morty specifically as an experiment or a project, and had then abandoned the project when it produced results that threatened him. The show's first season established that a Morty traveling beside a Rick functioned as a kind of neural camouflage, the Morty's brainwaves masking the Rick's distinctive intelligence signature. What would happen if a Morty's brainwaves began to approach a Rick's in complexity and strength? The camouflage would fail, and the Rick would suddenly be visible to every hostile intelligence in the multiverse. The darkest version of the original Morty theory held that evil Morty had become too smart and too dangerous to keep around, and that Rick's response had been to get rid of him, not through kindness, but through something more calculated and cold. This variant gained additional texture from details in the pilot episode, where Megatree seeds, objects the show established, could grant temporary superintelligence when ingested, were the stated purpose of the entire adventure. Rick's insistence on obtaining them had struck some theorists as disproportionate from the start, more urgent than a simple science project would warrant. If Rick had been raising a Morty whose intelligence was growing, the seeds would take on a different significance, a possible mechanism for enhancing or sustaining that growth. The flask theory, which gets its own full examination later in this discussion, grew partly out of this same line of thinking, the idea that Rick's relationship with various intelligence-enhancing substances was more deeply connected to the show's core mythology than it initially appeared. Even before the later seasons gave the audience firm ground to stand on, a section of the fandom had built a plausible and internally consistent theory of evil Morty's origin that touched nearly every mysterious element the show had introduced. The Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, then confirmed and complicated everything simultaneously. It confirmed the broadest strokes of what the theorists had been arguing, specifically that evil Morty's motivation was structural rather than personal, that his enemy was not Rick C-137 as an individual, but the entire Central Finite Curve and the arrangement of the multiverse that kept Morty's perpetually subordinate. It complicated the original Morty hypothesis by establishing that Rick C-137's biological Beth had been killed as a child by Rick Prime, which meant there had been no naturally occurring Morty C-137, since Morty requires a Beth who survived to adulthood and eventually had a child. The specific version of the theory that held evil Morty was Rick C-137's biological grandson was ruled out by the show's own lore. But the broader version, the one that simply held evil Morty was the Morty Rick C-137 had first mentored and then walked away from, was left open enough to remain viable. The Season 7 episode Unmortrican showed evil Morty's own extended backstory in a lengthy flashback, and that flashback conspicuously declined to answer the question of which Rick had been his original partner, leaving the original Morty theory in a strange, half-confirmed unconfirmed state, neither fully alive nor fully dead. The episode did confirm something the theories had circled without landing on directly, which was the full shape of evil Morty's consciousness. He had understood, at some point in his history, the totality of what the Citadel represented and what the Central Finite Curve meant for every Morty who ever lived inside it. And that understanding had not made him angry in the way a wronged child is angry. It had made him deliberate and patient in the way a person is who has decided that the entire system needs to end and has nothing but time. The backstory the episode provided traced his journey from an ordinary traveling partner to the president of the Citadel, to a man sitting in a quiet corner of infinite space, beyond the curve's borders, surrounded by the raw debris of alien life, looking genuinely at peace for the first time. The fandom had predicted his goal correctly. The motivation the episode gave him was more interesting than revenge, and colder. Other evil Morty theories that circulated before the confirmations arrived ranged from the plausible to the outright strange. One persistent theory held that evil Morty was actually a Rick who had performed a consciousness transfer into a Morty body, using the technology introduced in the second season episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, where Rick transfers his own mind into a younger clone. This would explain his intelligence and his drinking, since he is at one point seen pouring himself a glass of whiskey in a context where no other Morty ever drinks, and it would explain his fundamental orientation toward the Ricks as enemies rather than as gods. A Rick who had chosen to live as a Morty would understand both populations from the inside and would have every reason to despise the arrangement that made the distinction matter. The theory was elegant, and several of its details were compelling, but the Season 5 finale rendered it obsolete by establishing evil Morty's nature clearly enough that a consciousness transfer explanation became unnecessary. A third major theory held that evil Morty was not trying to destroy the Ricks at all, but was trying to protect the Mortys, that his apparent cruelty was instrumental rather than sadistic, and that his final goal was something closer to liberation than revenge. This reading was the most sympathetic available and turned out to be the most accurate. When he finally gave his full speech to Rick CC-137 and the Morty and Rick Mirai Jack, the vision he articulated was not a vision of conquest, it was a vision of a door. He wanted out, not supremacy. He did not want to rule the Ricks, or destroy them, or be the new smartest thing in the room. He wanted to live in a part of the multiverse, where no Rick had arranged the rules in his own favor, where the very concept of a Morty as a subordinate being had never taken hold, because the Ricks, who would have imposed that concept, had never arrived. The fandom theories that read evil Morty as a liberator rather than a conqueror were essentially correct, and the ones that read him as a revenge obsessive were essentially wrong, which says something interesting about the difference between the stories the audience expected and the story the show was telling. The song that played over evil Morty's first triumphant exit in Season 1 became its own thread in the theory culture. The track for The Damaged Coda by Blonde Redhead was an unusual choice for a children's animated series, spare and mournful and adult in a way that sat oddly alongside the comedy surrounding it. The fandom treated the song as a tonal cue, evidence that the show was asking the audience to feel something more complicated about this character than simple villainy warranted. A show scoring a villain's exit with a song about damage rather than triumph was signaling something about how it understood its own antagonist, and the theorists who caught that signal and built it into their readings of evil Morty's motivation were closer to the truth than the ones who simply cataloged his crimes. The music was the show's most honest statement about evil Morty before the dialogue was ready to make it, and the portion of the fandom paying close enough attention heard it clearly. What the evil Morty theories reveal collectively, regardless of which specific version proved accurate, is that the fandom had understood from the beginning that the show's most interesting question was not whether evil Morty could defeat Rick C-137 in a fight, but what it meant that a Morty had grown into something the system was not designed to produce. The Citadel ran on the assumption that Mortys were tools, and evil Morty was the proof of concept that the assumption was wrong, or rather that it could be made wrong by the right combination of exposure, anger, and time. The theorists who caught this understood something the show was careful not to state directly in its early seasons, that the mythology was built around the question of what a Morty becomes when a Rick takes him seriously, and what a Rick becomes when he stops being able to treat a Morty as a tool. Evil Morty was the answer to the first half of that question, and Rick C-137 was still working on the second half. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The evil Morty theories showed how a community of close readers could track a single character across years of scattered appearances and assemble a portrait the show had not yet finished painting. Next, the focus turns to the theory that lived longest in the fandom's imagination before the show confirmed it, the Central Finite Curve, and what the audience understood about its existence long before any character named it out loud. Section 3. The Central Finite Curve. Of all the theories the Rick and Morty fandom produced across its run, the one that aged best was also the one with the longest incubation period. The Central Finite Curve was mentioned by name in the 10th episode of the first season, dropped into a single line of dialogue by a member member of the Council of Ricks who calls Rick C-137 the most dangerous malcontent of all the Ricks in the Central Finite Curve, and the line lands so casually that most first-time viewers do not register it as significant at all. It sounds like one of the show's many invented bureaucratic phrases, the kind of terminology that populates the background of a densely imagined fictional universe and exists to make the world feel larger without necessarily meaning anything specific. A portion of the fandom heard it differently, and the theory they built around it over the next 4 years turned out to be one of the most accurate pieces of sustained analysis the community ever produced. The observation that started everything was simple but precise. The phrase "Central Finite Curve" implies a boundary. Finite implies a limit. Central implies there is something outside it. If Rick travels a multiverse described as infinite, and yet the organization governing that multiverse is named after a finite curve within it, then the multiverse Rick actually navigates is not the full infinity the show keeps invoking. It is a subset, a curated region, a selection. The implication sitting underneath that single throwaway line was that the show had been quietly building a much more complicated and much more troubling version of its own premise, one in which the freedom Rick seemed to possess was not freedom at all, but a very large cage whose walls had been designed to look like the edge of all creation. The fandom did not develop this reading immediately. The first season had too much new material to process, and the curve reference was easy to miss on a first pass. But by the middle of the second season, with the Council of Ricks established as a significant force and the Citadel of Ricks revealed as an entire civilization built around the fact of Rick's supremacy, the question of what the Central Finite Curve was and what it meant began to surface in online discussions. The most incisive early readings made the connection between the phrase and the show's broader treatment of Rick's intelligence, noting that the show kept gesturing toward a tension between the claim that Rick was the smartest being in the universe and the accumulating evidence that his universe was somehow controlled or managed in ways he did not fully acknowledge. The curve was the theoretical mechanism that would resolve that tension if it meant what it seemed to mean. The theory, as it developed through the third and fourth seasons, had several distinct versions, which reflected genuine uncertainty about how much the writers had planned versus how much they were building in response to audience attention. The conservative version held simply that the Central Finite Curve was a bounded region of the multiverse, that the Ricks had built or maintained some kind of border around a selection of realities, and that traveling outside that border was either impossible or deeply undesirable. This version was careful not to overspecify the purpose of the boundary, acknowledging that the show had not given the audience enough information to determine whether the curve was a defensive structure, a navigational artifact, or something more deliberately self-serving. This version of the theory was accurate in its broadest claims and honest about the gaps in the evidence. The more ambitious version went further and made the connection that the season 5 finale would eventually confirm almost word for word. This reading held that the Central Finite Curve was not merely a boundary around a region of the multiverse, but a curated collection of realities specifically selected or maintained on the basis of a single criterion, that Rick was the dominant intelligence in each of them. The curve, on this reading, was a mechanism for guaranteeing Rick's supremacy not through actual competition, but through the elimination of any reality where competition would be possible. The Ricks had not proven themselves the smartest beings across all of existence. They had drawn a wall around the portion of existence where they were guaranteed to be the smartest, and then pretended the wall was the horizon. Every adventure, every victory, every moment of Rick standing at the top of the cosmic hierarchy had taken place on a stage the Ricks themselves had built and stocked with opponents they had already vetted. The evidence for this more ambitious version was scattered across the show in details that required the full run of the first 4 seasons to accumulate into a convincing case. The Citadel itself was one piece of it. An entire civilization built by Ricks required, as a precondition, that the Ricks had been able to identify and gather every version of themselves across the multiverse, which in turn required that they had some mechanism for knowing where in the infinite multiverse a Rick existed. A genuinely infinite, unbounded multiverse would make that task logically impossible, since infinity contains no register of its own contents. The fact that the Citadel existed at all implied that the Ricks were not working with an unbounded infinity, but with a managed subset. The logistics of the Citadel silently demanded the curve without ever naming it. The second piece of evidence was stranger and subtler. Across the first 4 seasons, the show featured dozens of alien species, galactic governments, and beings of various kinds, and a recurring feature of almost all of them was that Rick was smarter. Not just smarter in specific domains, not just more technologically advanced, but comprehensively, categorically more intelligent to a degree that suggested a fundamental difference in kind rather than degree. In a genuinely infinite multiverse, a species that had evolved for millions of years longer than humanity, or a civilization that had solved problems of physics that Rick was still working on, should appear with some regularity. The show kept not producing them. The audience that noticed this absence began to read it as a structural structural feature rather than a narrative convenience, the result of a selection mechanism that had filtered them out. Outside the walls of the Central Finite Curve, those beings presumably existed in abundance, which was precisely why the curve was necessary. The third piece came from the treatment of portal technology itself. Rick's portal gun was presented as uniquely his, the product of a breakthrough no other species had achieved, the formula for the green portal fluid, the most guarded secret in the show's mythology. But if the multiverse were genuinely infinite and had been evolving for infinite time, the probability that exactly one being had cracked the physics of interdimensional travel was effectively zero. The theory that the curve explained this detail was compelling, because outside the curve, portal technology presumably existed in the hands of other species and other kinds of minds, and the Ricks had built their border precisely to avoid the universe in which their most valuable invention was not unique. The yellow portal gun that Evil Morty uses at the end of the Season 5 finale, a portal technology distinct from Rick's green portals that works outside the curve, was the show's confirmation of exactly this implication, though the audience who had been following the theory did not need to wait for confirmation to understand what it meant. The color distinction between the two portal technologies became its own thread within the broader curve theory, and it was a thread the fandom had begun pulling before the finale made it explicit. Rick's green portals had always been the visual signature of his particular brand of interdimensional travel, so deeply associated with him that the green fluid had become the show's most recognizable piece of iconography outside the characters themselves. When Evil Morty departed the Citadel through a yellow portal in the Season 5 finale, the color was not a random aesthetic choice. The theorists who had been tracking the curve recognized it immediately as confirmation that yellow represented travel outside the curve's boundaries, a technology operating on different principles than Rick's, accessible from a part of the multiverse the green portal gun could not reach. Several fans noted that this distinction had been hiding in plain sight in the show's own visual language for years, that the green of Rick's portals was the green of the Central Finite Curve itself, a color coding the show had maintained consistently without ever drawing attention to what it meant. The Season 5 finale landing confirmed the theory so completely that several of the most prominent theory creators online posted responses noting that the show had essentially played back their own argument through Evil Morty's monologue. His description of the curve as an infinite crib built around an infinite baby, as a wall the Ricks had built around the part of reality where they were guaranteed to win, matched the most developed versions of the fan theory almost exactly. What the episode added was the emotional weight the theory had always implied, but the fandom had rarely dwelt on, the realization that this was not simply a structural fact about the show's universe, but a devastatingly personal fact about Rick himself. The man who kept describing the multiverse as infinite and meaningless had spent his life in a corner of it he had carefully arranged to be safe, and the nihilism and the cowardice were not separate traits, but the same trait seen from different angles. The question the theory had never fully resolved, and that the confirmation left partially open, concerned who had actually built the curve and why. The show's own account, delivered through Evil Morty and then elaborated in the Dimension C-137 lore, suggested that Rick C-137 had been instrumental in its construction, as part of the broader project of founding the Citadel after the loss of Diane. This gave the curve's existence a tragic motivation that some early theorists had intuited, the possibility that it was built not purely out of arrogance, but out of the desire to wall off the specific Rick who killed Diane, to narrow the field of realities Rick C-137 had to search while hunting for his counterpart. Evil Morty's reading of the curve as pure vanity, and the show's own backstory suggesting it was partly a grief project, are not fully reconcilable, and the tension between them is one the writers left in place rather than resolving. A fan theory running alongside the curve theory, and receiving some confirmation from the same episode, concerned what existed outside the curve. The fandom had long speculated that the true multiverse beyond Rick's curated subset would be stranger and more dangerous than anything the show had depicted, populated by beings of comparable or superior intelligence, operating with technologies and frameworks the Ricks had never encountered. The brief glimpse the Season 5 finale and then the 7th season episode Unmortrican gave of the space beyond the curve confirmed this in broad terms, showing a chaotic and hostile environment full of creatures and conditions Rick's portal gun had never taken him anywhere near. Evil Morty, sitting peacefully in his pocket of that chaos, looking genuinely calm in a way he never looked inside the curve, was the image that finished the theory's argument, the proof that the freedom Rick had always claimed to represent was something Evil Morty had actually found, outside the walls Rick helped build. What made the Central Finite Curve theory so satisfying when it was confirmed, and what separates it from most fan theories that turn out to be right, is that the confirmation did not merely verify a plot point, it reframed the entire series. Every episode set before the confirmation now reads differently, because the audience understands that all of it took place inside a lie the protagonist helped construct. The adventures were real, the consequences were real, but the context in which they occurred was a fiction maintained by the smartest men in the multiverse for the benefit of the smartest men in the multiverse. The theory was not just correct about a detail, it was correct about what the show was fundamentally about, which is an unusual achievement for any piece of fan analysis, and which explains why the community that produced it treated the finale not as a surprise, but as a long-awaited acknowledgement. The curve theory also illuminates something important about how the fandom worked at its best. The viewers who built this theory were not guessing. They were reasoning from the show's own internal logic, treating its invented world as a coherent system whose implications could be followed wherever they led. The single throwaway line in Season 1 was not an accident. The show had planted it, knowing that someone would eventually pull the thread, and it had built enough of the supporting structure in the subsequent seasons to reward the pulling. The Central Finite Curve is the clearest example in the show's history of a production team and its audience in genuine collaboration. The writers hiding something in plain sight, and the audience finding it on exactly the schedule the writers had hoped. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The curve theory showed a fandom that could read structural implications from a single phrase and follow them to the truth across 4 years of episodes. Next, the focus turns to a smaller but equally precise theory, the one built around a ticket number that did not match, and what that mismatch quietly broke open about the show's own continuity. Section 4. The ticket theory. Fan theories about Rick and Morty tend to start with something enormous: years of planted mythology, a recurring villain, a phrase seeded across multiple seasons. The ticket theory started with a number, specifically, a number printed on a slip of paper visible for approximately 3 seconds of screen time in the background of a Jerry daycare joke in an episode most viewers remember for an entirely different reason. That a theory built on so little evidence became one of the most discussed pieces of fan analysis the show ever generated says something about the community that built it and something more interesting about the show that made it possible. The episode at the center of the theory is Mortonite Run, the second episode of the second season, and its surface story is easy to summarize and genuinely good. Morty tries to save a sentient gas cloud named Fart from the cheerful assassin Krombopulos Michael, whom Rick has just sold an antimatter gun, and the episode builds its moral comedy out of the gap between Morty's noble intentions and the cascading damage those intentions produce. He gets people killed trying to protect a being who, it emerges, intends to destroy all carbon-based life in the universe once it is free, and he ends up using the very weapon he condemned Rick for selling to finish what Krombopulos Michael started. The episode is one of the show's cleaner statements of its comedic nihilism, the idea that good intentions in an indifferent universe are not just ineffective but often counterproductive, and it works well on its own terms regardless of anything else happening in the background. The background is where the theory lives. Before the adventure begins, Rick and Morty need to deposit Jerry somewhere for the duration, and they bring him to the Jerry Boree, a daycare facility serving the multiverse's enormous population of largely interchangeable Jerrys. The sequence is played for comedy, the attendants managing the Jerrys with the cheerful bureaucratic efficiency of people who have long since stopped finding anything surprising about their work, and Rick fills out an intake form with details the episode presents as throwaway gags. He marks himself as Rick C-137, the established designation for the Rick the series follows. He marks Jerry's home dimension as not applicable because the Jerry he is dropping off came from the replacement dimension Rick and Morty moved into after the catastrophe of Rick Potion number 9, not from C-137 itself. The attendant processes the form and hands them a claim ticket, and the ticket number is 5126. The adventure runs its course. Near the episode's end, Rick and Morty return to the Jerry Boree to collect their Jerry, and the scene plays as a brief comedy beat about how difficult it is to tell Jerrys apart. Morty has lost the ticket. There is mild confusion and some shuffling of nearly identical men. 2 Ricks appear to be involved in the retrieval. There is a casual acknowledgement that one of them has ticket 5126, and the Ricks shrug and each takes a Jerry, and everyone moves on. The show treats the moment as a small gag and does not signal that anything unusual has occurred. The scene is over in under a minute, and the episode wraps shortly after. The detail that broke everything open for the fandom was simple and specific. The Rick shown holding ticket 5126 at the conclusion of the Jerry Boree scene was not the Rick the episode had followed through its entire runtime. The Rick C-137, who dropped off Jerry with ticket 5126, departed the facility without it. A different Rick held the ticket. The swap went the wrong direction, and the camera captured it, and the show moved on as though it had not happened. This was either a continuity error too minor to correct, which is the simplest explanation, or it was exactly what it looked like. A quiet and unannounced shift in which Rick and Morty the audience was watching had been exchanged for a different pair without ceremony or acknowledgement. The YouTube channel The Save Point Guild was the first to formalize this observation into a coherent theoretical framework, and the argument it assembled was methodical enough to carry real persuasive weight. If the swap occurred as the visual detail implied, then the Rick and Morty who exited the Jerry Barrie were not C-137's pair, but a different pairing from a different dimension, identical in every relevant respect to the C-137 Rick and Morty, but genuinely distinct from them. The show's point of view had shifted without announcement, and the episodes following Mortonite Run in the second season were technically set in a household that belonged to Dimension 526 rather than to the dimension the series had spent its entire first season establishing. The audience had been watching the right show with the wrong cast, and the switch had been made in the background of a Jerry daycare joke, the most deliberately undignified location the writers could have chosen for a narrative sleight of hand of that magnitude. The implication for the episodes that followed was significant and strange. Total Recall, airing 2 episodes after Mortonite Run, introduced a character named Mr. Poopy Butthole as an apparent long-term family friend of the Smiths, a bright-eyed, cheerful presence who had supposedly been part of their lives for years. The episode's premise was that alien parasites were embedding false memories in the household, and the family spent the episode trying to determine which of their acquaintances were real and which were parasite constructs. Mr. Poopy Butthole passed the test. The show stated definitively that he was real, that he had genuinely known this family for years, and Beth shooting him in a moment of misplaced suspicion carried genuine emotional weight precisely because the show was insisting on his authenticity. The ticket theory made Mr. Poopy Butthole's sudden unexplained presence into something other than a continuity lapse. In Dimension 526's household, he had always been a family friend. The reason he had never appeared or been mentioned in the first season, or the opening episodes of the second, was not that the show had forgotten to introduce him earlier, but that the show had been following a different household, one where he did not exist, and had only arrived at his household after the Jerry Barrie swap. The theory did not require the show to have made a mistake. It required the show to have made a deliberate and unannounced choice, and it provided a cleaner explanation for Mr. Poopy Butthole's existence than any alternative the episode's own premise offered. The alien parasite framing was not a misdirection designed to explain Mr. Poopy Butthole away. It was a genuine threat to a character who was genuinely real, in a household that had genuinely known him, in a dimension the audience had not technically visited until 2 episodes prior. The piece of evidence that the theory's proponents found most compelling was a prop connection between the 2 episodes that required the theory to be true in order to make sense. Near the end of Mortonite Run, Rick gathered a collection of glowing green and pink crystals from the alien environment he and Morty had been passing through, pocketing them without comment in a moment the episode treated as background business. At the very start of Total Recall, 2 episodes later, Rick was shown pulling those same distinctive crystals from his pocket and dumping them in the trash, again without comment. The crystals had no plot function in either episode. They appeared once, traveled 2 episodes, and were discarded. Their only apparent purpose was to establish a visual continuity between the Rick at the end of Mortonite Run and the Rick at the beginning of Total Recall, confirming that despite the Jerry Barrie swap, they were watching the same individual across those episodes. The crystals were a bridge, and the bridge implied the gap it was spanning. Without the gap, the bridge had no reason to exist. The theory's expansion into a broader claim about the second season produced more disagreement within the fandom than the core observation about the swap itself. Some theorists argued that the ticket theory implied the show had never been rigidly committed to following a single definitive pair of protagonists, that any episode failing to explicitly confirm the dimensional designation of its Rick and Morty could theoretically be set in any of infinite dimensions, and that the entire premise of a continuous narrative following specific characters was a useful fiction rather than a structural fact. This expansive reading made the show sound more vertiginous than most viewers wanted it to be, dissolving the narrative ground beneath the audience's feet rather than simply noting a single quiet swap, and it attracted less support than the narrower version, which held that the swap was real but contained, affecting a specific stretch of episodes before the C-137 pair resumed the foreground. The narrower version had its own complications, chief among them the question of when exactly the swap reversed itself, if it ever did. The ticket theory's original formulation identified the crystal prop as the bridge between Mortonite Run and Total Recall, establishing continuity through those 2 episodes. But the theory offered no clear mechanism for how or when the C-137 pair would have reclaimed the foreground. Some theorists argued the reversal never happened, that the Rick and Morty the audience followed from that point forward were always Dimension 526's pair, and that C-137's Rick and Morty were simply out there somewhere, living their own adventures the show never bothered to depict. Others argued that the show's explicit use of the C-137 designation in later episodes, particularly in the 3rd season premiere, when Morty identifies himself as Morty C-137 to the Council of Ricks, retroactively confirmed that the main pair had returned to their established identity at some point, closing the loop the theory had opened without the show ever formally acknowledging it had been open. The creators Readers responded to the theory with the oblique non-commitment that characterized their handling of most fan readings that touched on dimensional continuity. Harmon's various interview responses over the years suggested genuine awareness of the ticket theory and a considered ambivalence about whether the show's dimensional logic should be understood as airtight or as a flexible narrative tool that the production used pragmatically and the audience should not hold to strict account. The creative philosophy of Rick and Morty, especially through its first several seasons, was not to build an internally consistent universe and then maintain it with scrupulous care, but to build the impression of an internally consistent universe and then work within that impression as needed, using the rules when they served the story and quietly setting them aside when they did not. Whether the ticket theory described a deliberate choice or an accidental detail the writers had found too interesting to correct was a question they declined to resolve, which functioned as its own kind of answer. A show willing to confirm or deny the theory would have confirmed or denied it. The silence was a form of permission, an acknowledgement that the reading was close enough to something intentional that closing it off felt like a cost. The theory also raised a question that extended well beyond the specific episodes it addressed, which was the question of what dimensional continuity meant in a show that had already established the practice of abandoning one reality for another. The show's own history, the Rick Potion number 9 catastrophe, and the replacement dimension that followed it, had already demonstrated that Rick was capable of treating entire realities as disposable and stepping into new ones without ceremony. If Rick could do that once, for narrative reasons the show depicted explicitly, the possibility that the show itself had done something structurally similar in the background of a Season 2 episode was not a wild extension of the premise. It was a logical application of the same mechanic at a different level. The narrative machinery of the show replicating the behavior of its protagonist, slipping from one version of a reality to another, and declining to announce the transition. The durability of the ticket theory across the show's run, continuing to circulate as standard Rick and Morty lore through seasons that the theory itself could not have anticipated, rests partly on the precision of its evidence and partly on the larger question it opened. At its core, the theory was not really about a ticket number or a daycare swap. It was about what it means to follow specific characters in a universe that contains infinite copies of them, about whether the attachment the audience formed to a particular Rick and Morty was an attachment to individuals or to a type, and about what it would mean if the individuals and the type were, from the outside, indistinguishable. These questions were ones the show kept returning to and expanding across its whole run, through the Beth clone, through the Mortyplicity decoy families, through the Citadel's entire architecture of interchangeable Ricks and disposable Mortys. The ticket theory arrived at these questions first, through the smallest possible door, and the questions it opened turned out to be the questions the show was most interested in asking. That is its real legacy in the fandom, not the specific claim about Dimension 526, but the methodological demonstration that the show was built with enough internal density that a few seconds of background business in a Jerry daycare could carry genuine theoretical weight. After the ticket theory, the community of close readers understood that the level of attention it required was the level the show actually repaid, and the subsequent years of increasingly sophisticated fan analysis were the direct consequence of that understanding. A number on a ticket changed how a significant portion of the audience watched a television show, which is an unusual achievement for a prop that existed on screen for less time than it takes to read its own face value. The ticket theory also illuminated something specific about the relationship between Mortonite Run and the show's broader philosophy. The episode was already a statement about the limits of moral certainty in a multiverse, about the impossibility of clean choices in a universe that is always producing consequences faster than intentions can manage them. The ticket theory added a layer to that statement, because if the episode involved a quiet swap of protagonists that the show declined to acknowledge, then even the moral framework the audience uses to evaluate Morty's choices in the episode is contingent on an identity claim the show has already destabilized. The Morty whose conscience drives the episode's plot may not be the Morty the audience has been invested in, which does not change what happens, but changes what it means, introducing the same uncertainty about the protagonist's identity that the episode introduces about the protagonist's morality. The theory and the episode turn out to be about the same thing: the difficulty of knowing with confidence who is standing in front of you and what they owe to the choices that brought them there. The deeper resonance of the ticket theory within the show's overall architecture becomes clearest when it is placed alongside the mythology the later seasons built about the Citadel. The entire society of the Citadel was constructed on the premise that individual Ricks and Mortys were fungible, that one Rick was replaceable by another with minimal disruption, and that the distinctions between any two versions of the same person were less significant than what they shared. The ticket theory was an early and miniature version of that premise, enacted not in the halls of an interdimensional civilization, but in the bureaucratic shuffle of a daycare pickup. The Citadel made the interchangeability of Ricks and Mortys into a governing ideology, a social and economic system built on the assumption that none of them mattered individually. The Jerry swap enacted the same logic at the level of a throw throwaway gag, the same shrug of equivalence, the same casual willingness to take home whichever version was available and call it close enough. The theory's relationship to the Mortyplicity episode of the 5th season is equally telling. That episode deployed an entire narrative built around the impossibility of identifying which version of the Smith family was the original, with decoy families hunting decoy families in an escalating cascade of violence and confusion that the show played for dark comedy while keeping the underlying question genuinely unresolved. The ticket theory had posed the same question in miniature years earlier through a daycare slip rather than an army of decoys, and the show's eventual willingness to make that question the entire premise of a full episode suggests that the writers understood it as one of the series' central concerns, the question of which version of a person is the real one and whether the distinction matters. The ticket theory was the first draft of that question, assembled by a viewer paying close attention to a prop that was never meant to anchor anything. What the ticket theory ultimately demanded of its audience was a form of attention that the show had not formally requested, but had quietly been rewarding from its very first episode. The habit of treating every visual choice as intentional, every background detail as a potential statement, every apparent coincidence as a possible design. That demand was also a description of how the show wanted to be experienced at its deepest level, not as a comedy to be enjoyed and forgotten, but as a text to be reread, a thing built with enough care that a second and third and 10th pass through the same material would keep producing new information. The ticket number 5126 was the show extending that invitation in its most concentrated form, a detail so small and so precisely placed that finding it required exactly the quality of attention the whole series had been cultivating, and rewarding it with a question large enough to occupy the fandom for years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The ticket theory showed how a single mismatched number could open a question about whether the show's own protagonists are who the audience assumes they are. Next, the focus turns to a theory built around Rick's most iconic prop, the flask he never sets down, and the fan argument that what is inside it might explain everything the show says about his intelligence. Section 5. The Flask and the Mega Seeds. Every version of Rick Sanchez, across every dimension the show has ever visited, carries a flask. It is the most consistent physical fact about him, more reliable than the lab coat, more present than the portal gun, a prop that appears in nearly every scene he occupies, regardless of what else is happening around him. He drinks from it during crises and during calm, during combat and during family dinners, in alien prisons and in his own garage. The flask is so constant that it fades into background noise for most viewers, filed away as a character shorthand for alcoholism and registered no further. A portion of the fandom filed it differently, and the theory they built around it was one of the most elegant the community produced. A reading of a single prop that, if correct, would reframe the central fact the entire series rested on. The theory begins in the pilot episode, which introduced the Megatree seeds alongside the portal gun as the two objects Rick most urgently needed. The seeds come from a specific plant species that the show establishes, clearly and without ambiguity, can grant temporary superintelligence when ingested. By the end of the pilot, a quantity of megaseeds has dissolved inside Morty's body after being smuggled through customs in a way the episode treats as broadly comedic, and the effect on Morty is immediate and dramatic. He disarms a neutrino bomb, speaks in complete technical sentences, and carries himself with a confidence and capability entirely absent from his normal personality. Then the seeds metabolize fully, the effect fades, and Morty spends the next several days drooling, unable to form coherent sentences, barely able to stand. The intelligence the seeds grant is real, significant, and temporary, and the crash that follows their depletion is proportionally severe. The fandom noticed two details that the pilot does not comment on, and that the show never returned to directly. The first was that Morty's behavior while the seeds were active, the drooling, the slurred baseline cognition, the physical unsteadiness, bore a resemblance to Rick's baseline presentation in his least defended moments. The burping, the occasional slurring, the physical looseness that looks like intoxication, but sits slightly differently than simple drunkenness. The second detail was Rick's level of urgency around the seeds in the pilot, an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the stated purpose of wanting them for science. Rick is a man who can build a universe in an afternoon to power his car. He does not need megaseeds for any specific scientific application that the pilot bothers to name. His insistence on obtaining them, and his willingness to endanger Morty to do so, suggested to the theorizing portion of the audience that the seeds mattered to him personally rather than professionally. From these two observations, the theory assembled itself quickly. The liquid in Rick's flask was not, or not only, alcohol. It was a preparation made from megaseed extract, a distillation of the intelligence-granting compound maintained at a concentration that could be administered in small doses over time, rather than all at once. Rick was not natively the smartest being in any universe. He was a man of above-average intelligence, who had discovered the seeds, worked out how to process and maintain their active compound, and had been supplementing his own cognition with them for long enough enough that the enhancement had become his baseline. The drool, the slurring, the physical looseness were not signs of heavy drinking, but signs of an intelligence serum being maintained in an organic brain that had adapted to running at a level it was never biologically designed to sustain. Every Rick in every dimension presented the same traits because every Rick had independently arrived at the same formula or shared it through the Citadel, and the drool was not a character quirk but a physiological side effect. The theory was genuinely compelling because it solved a real problem the show had created. Rick's intelligence, as depicted, is not merely extraordinary by human standards, it is categorically different, operating at a level that no amount of natural variation in human cognition could plausibly produce. He invents faster than most people think, understands systems of physics that have no known analog in real science, and builds working devices from categories of technology that should require entire civilizations of scientists collaborating across generations. The gap between his intellect and the next most intelligent human in the show is not a gap of degree, but a gap of kind, and the show never explains how one human being arrived at that level of cognition through natural development. The megaseed theory explained it, providing a mechanism by which an ordinarily intelligent person could bootstrap himself into a genuinely alien order of mental capacity through chemical enhancement, and it explained why the enhancement required maintenance, why the flask never left his hand, and why running out of the preparation would be a crisis rather than an inconvenience. The theory also carried a darker implication that some theorists found more interesting than the intelligence explanation itself. If Rick's genius was chemically maintained rather than innate, then the person he would be without the flask was not the smartest man in any universe, but something much closer to an ordinary human being, frightened and grieving, and without any of the tools that had made him the person the show depicted. The intelligence would be real while it was running, the inventions genuinely his, the thoughts authentically produced by his own mind under enhancement, but the substrate underneath it, the person who had started taking the seeds before any of the legend existed, would be someone the audience had never seen, and who Rick would do almost anything to avoid being again. The addiction would not be to alcohol, or not only to alcohol, but to the version of himself the seeds made possible, and the drinking would be both the mechanism and the cover, a thing that looked like a vice when it was actually a lifeline. The show's creators addressed the theory more directly than they addressed most fan readings, and their response was one of the more interesting creative deflections the Rick and Morty team ever performed. At San Diego Comic-Con in 2016, both Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland were asked explicitly about the contents of Rick's flask. Roiland offered a deliberately mundane answer, suggesting Rick was simply a connoisseur of good liquor who used his portal technology to source premium spirits from dimensions where they were cheap. Harmon offered a stranger answer, suggesting the flask might contain coolant droplets from the film Event Horizon, a horror movie whose central premise involves a spacecraft that had inadvertently traveled to a dimension of pure suffering and returned carrying a contamination that drove its crew to destroy themselves. The joke is dark in a way that is hard to dismiss as purely accidental, because it connects Rick's drinking to a source of cosmic horror rather than simple vice, and it gestures at exactly the kind of self-destructive relationship with the flask that the megaseed theory had identified, without confirming the specific mechanism. Neither answer confirmed the theory, and Roiland in the same conversation said outright that accepting the megaseed reading would fundamentally undermine what the show was saying about Rick as a character, because it would transform his intelligence from an innate gift into a purchased one. This objection was taken seriously by some theorists and dismissed by others. The dismissers pointed out that the show had already substantially undermined Rick's intelligence through the Central Finite Curve, and that a version of Rick whose genius was chemically maintained would be, if anything, more interesting than the version who had simply been born extraordinary, because it would explain his relationship with the flask and his terror of stillness as two faces of the same dependence. The defenders of the show's framing pointed out that the intelligence being innate was not simply a flattering fiction, but a thematic necessity, because the show's argument about what intelligence costs requires that the intelligence itself be real and native, that it be something Rick genuinely is, rather than something he takes. The debate between these positions never fully resolved, and the show did not resolve it, maintaining the flask as an ambiguous prop that could be read either way, without either reading being definitively confirmed or denied. This ambiguity was itself significant. The show's resistance to closing the question suggested awareness of it, and the Roiland response at Comic-Con, rather than settling the matter, simply added the creator's stated preference to the evidence pile without constituting anything like canon. A show that had confirmed other fan readings through its eventual narrative choices had, in this case, chosen to let the prop remain unresolved, which some theorists read as a soft confirmation that the ambiguity was deliberate and that the megaseed reading was close enough to something true that closing it off felt like a cost. Later seasons added texture to the question without answering it. The fourth season opener, Edge of Tomorty, showed Rick in a state of extreme extreme physiological stress as he body-hopped through dying versions of himself, and the depiction of his mental state during that sequence was specific enough to fuel both sides of the flask debate. A man running purely on alcohol would not necessarily show the kind of precise, structured cognition Rick demonstrates under extreme physiological pressure, but a man running on an intelligence supplement being depleted might behave exactly as Rick does during that sequence, maintaining function while clearly deteriorating. The evidence remained interpretable in both directions, which is its own kind of answer about how much the show wanted the question settled. What the flask theory contributed most durably to the fan culture was not a specific conclusion about the prop-in, but a framing for Rick's addiction that took it seriously as a narrative element rather than a character quirk. The theory insisted that the flask was meaningful, that the drinking was load-bearing in the story the show was telling, and that dismissing it as background detail was a mistake. This insistence proved correct, even if the specific megaseed mechanism was not the right explanation, because the show's later seasons gave the drinking genuine weight, connecting it explicitly to isolation and grief. The flask had always been doing more work than it appeared to be doing, and the fan community that refused to treat it as pure comedy background was reading the show accurately even when the specific theory was wrong. The question of what Rick would be without the flask, which the theory raised most sharply, was one the show eventually addressed through the Rest and Rick-laxation episode, where the detoxing process splits Rick into a healthy version and a version made of everything toxic he had buried. The toxic self carries his fear, his self-loathing, and the raw need he spends every waking hour managing out of sight. Whether the flask is an intelligence supplement or simply alcohol, what it covers is the same in either reading, a man using a chemical relationship to maintain a distance from feelings he will not face sober. The mega seed theory and the simpler alcoholism reading converge at that point, because the function of the flask is the same regardless of what is inside it. Rick drinks to stay Rick, and what he is running from when he drinks is the version of himself that exists without it. The flask theory also connects productively to the way the show portrays every other Rick in the multiverse. One of the most striking facts established through the Citadel episodes is that the drooling, the slurring, the physical looseness, the general presentation of a brilliant mind housed in a body treated with casual contempt is not specific to Rick C-137, but is shared by virtually every Rick across the Central Finite Curve. If the traits were simply the result of heavy drinking, the uniformity would be unremarkable, because one could imagine every Rick independently developing an alcohol problem as a response to the same combination of isolation and nihilism. But the uniformity also fits the megaseed reading with uncomfortable precision, because if every Rick arrived at the same intelligence enhancement formula through independent discovery or through the Citadel's shared knowledge base, then every Rick would be running the same compound in the same organic system and displaying the same side effects. The drool is not individual pathology. It is a species characteristic of a man who is something other than what he appears to be, and the uniformity of it across infinite versions of the same person is harder to explain through coincidental lifestyle choices than through a shared underlying mechanism. The show's pilot, rewatched with the theory in mind, carries a different weight than it did on first viewing. Rick's urgency around the seeds, his specific need to retrieve them from the megatrees personally rather than sending anyone else, his willingness to use a child as a mule for the smuggling operation, all of these read less like the eccentricities of a genius pursuing a scientific interest and more like the calculated moves of an addict managing a supply chain. The adventure that launches the entire series, the mission that establishes what Rick and Morty's relationship will look like and what Morty is for, was from the beginning a trip made in the service of a dependency the show has never directly confirmed and has never fully allowed the audience to dismiss. The flask sits at the center of that ambiguity, holding whatever it holds, and the fandom has been arguing about the contents ever since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The flask theory showed a fandom willing to interrogate the show's most fundamental premise, the nature of Rick's intelligence itself, through the evidence of a single prop that never left his hand. Next, the focus turns to the theories that asked an even more unsettling question, whether any of what the audience has been watching is real at all, and what the simulation, inside a simulation, inside a simulation, in Season 1, was actually trying to tell us. Section 6. The simulation theories. The simulation theories that grew up around the series fed directly on that dread, and the episode that launched them was built to do exactly that, a first-season installment that stacked constructed realities inside each other until the audience could no longer be certain which layer was the outermost one, and then declined to confirm that any layer was. The episode is M. Night's Shame Aliens, the fourth episode of the first season, and its premise is that an alien species called the Zigguryons, described as the universe's most incompetent con artists, have trapped Rick and Jerry inside an elaborate simulation designed to trick Rick into revealing the formula for his concentrated dark matter. The simulation is convincing enough to fool Jerry completely, but not quite convincing enough to fool Rick, who detects the artificiality almost immediately through small inconsistencies in the physics around him and proceeds to feed his captors a fake recipe while appearing to be genuinely deceived. The episode builds its comedy around Rick playing along with the illusion while clearly not being fooled, and it resolves cleanly when Rick's fake recipe destroys the alien ship, freeing him and Jerry from the simulation. The resolution should have ended the question of whether the simulation was real. It did not, because the episode contains a detail that does not resolve cleanly within the official ending. Inside the simulation, Rick and Jerry encounter a group of Plutonian aliens, a species that the show does not introduce in its regular continuity until several episodes later. There is no clean explanation for why a species, the Zagarians, should have no reason to include in their simulation of Earth would appear inside it before they appear in the actual show's universe. The detail is small enough to be a continuity error, which is the simplest explanation and almost certainly the correct one. The fan community treated it as something else. The theory that emerged argued that Rick never escaped the simulation at all. The apparent resolution, the fake recipe, the destruction of the alien ship, the return to ordinary life, was simply the next layer of the deception, a more convincing version of the same trap designed to make Rick believe he had won and lower his guard. Under this reading, every episode of Rick and Morty following M. Night Shyamalan aliens takes place inside a simulation that Rick has not detected, making him the one character in the show's history who has been comprehensively fooled, the smartest man in the universe, defeated not by superior intelligence, but by a sufficiently convincing artificial reality. The Plutonian cameo was the crack in the wall of the outermost simulation, a detail the Zagarians got wrong the same way they got smaller details wrong in the layers Rick did detect, and the audience that spotted it was seeing what Rick had not. The appeal of the theory was partly its structural elegance and partly its thematic precision, because a version of Rick trapped inside a simulation he believed he had escaped was a version of Rick the show was already building toward in other ways. His nihilism, his insistence that nothing finally matters, his comfort with the disposability of any given reality, all of these traits would read differently if the specific reality he was inhabiting were itself a constructed fiction. The man who preached the meaninglessness of any single universe would be living proof of his own thesis in the most literal possible way, unable to distinguish his own constructed cage from the genuine infinite he claimed to navigate. The theory was, in this sense, the show's own nihilist philosophy turned back on its protagonist, and the fandom found that irony compelling enough to sustain the argument past the point where the evidence strictly supported it. The problem with the simulation theory was always the same problem that faces any comprehensive skeptical hypothesis, which is that it is both unfalsifiable and structurally corrosive. If the show is a simulation, then every subsequent episode either confirms the simulation by depicting Rick failing to escape, or is itself simply another layer of the same trap, and the distinction between those two possibilities cannot be made from inside the theory. The theory cannot be disproven by any piece of evidence the show produces, because any evidence against it can be absorbed as further evidence for it, a more convincing level of simulation, designed to forestall the revelation. A theory that cannot be disproven by any possible evidence is a theory that explains nothing in particular, and the simulation reading eventually collapsed under its own weight for most of the fandom, even as it retained a devoted minority who kept the argument alive across subsequent seasons. What kept the theory circulating longer than its evidence strictly warranted was the show's own relationship with simulation as a recurring theme. Rick and Morty returned to constructed realities, artificial minds, and the question of what distinguishes a real experience from a fabricated one more often than almost any other animated series. And it did so with enough philosophical seriousness that the simulation reading always felt like it was in conversation with the show's genuine concerns, even when it was not confirmed by them. The Roy game in Mortonite Run, in which a character can live an entire simulated human life in a video game arcade booth and emerge having genuinely experienced love and loss and death, is one of the show's most unsettling sequences, precisely because it refuses to dismiss the simulated life as less real than the framing reality. The Zygerian simulation, the Rick brainalization sequence in the third season premiere, the Story Train episode in the fourth season, all of these kept the question of simulated versus authentic reality alive in the show's texture, even as the plot never confirmed the specific M. Night Shyamalan's reading, a secondary simulation theory developed around the brainalization sequence in the Rick Shank Redemption, the third season opener, and this one was more structurally interesting because it concerned a simulation the show depicted explicitly rather than one it implied. The Federation uses a machine to walk through Rick's own memories in search of the portal fluid formula, and Rick's escape involves feeding the machine a fabricated origin story while running his actual plan beneath the performance. The theory that developed around this sequence concerned the reliability of the memory Rick fabricated, specifically whether the emotional content of the fabricated memory, his attachment to his family, his apparent grief about his past, might be more truthful than the fabrication framing suggested. The episode stages the fabrication as a calculated deception, but some theorists argued that a man lying to a mind-reading machine about his feelings was not necessarily lying about the feelings themselves, only about their origin, and that the simulated Rick who loved his family in the fabricated memory was doing something real even inside the fiction. This reading connected productively to the broader question of Rick's emotional life, which the show was developing through the same seasons the simulation theories were circulating. It also connected to one of the most durable smaller theories the fandom maintained, the hair theory built around M. Night Shame Aliens itself. A close reading of that episode noticed that Rick checks the texture of Morty's hair at two separate moments, once in a subtle noogie during an escape sequence, and once in the post-credits scene where he bursts into the real Morty's room after returning home. The theory held that the hair texture was Rick's personal method for detecting simulated matter, that the Zagarians had failed to perfectly replicate the specific physical properties of Morty's hair, and that Rick had been using that tell to distinguish real from simulated throughout the episode. The after-credits hair check was, on this reading, not a comedy beat about Rick being paranoid, but a genuine verification that the Morty in front of him was real, performed with the controlled casualness of a man who had learned to trust nothing without checking. The hair theory was plausible and carefully assembled, and the fandom treated it with more seriousness than the broader simulation theory, because it was specific rather than comprehensive. It did not claim that everything after the episode was simulated. It claimed that Rick had a method for testing reality that the show had depicted twice in the same episode, and that the method revealed something about his level of permanent wariness about constructed environments. This smaller reading aged well because it fit what the show established about Rick's cognition without requiring the narrative to be something it demonstrably was not. The simulation theories as a family reveal something important about how the fan community related to the show's deepest thematic concerns. The readings that held up were the ones that engaged with simulation as a motif the show was genuinely exploring, a question about the nature and reliability of experience that recurred throughout the series without ever being answered definitively. The reading that did not hold up was the one that tried to make the motif into a plot, to literalize the philosophical question into a specific narrative claim about whether the show's own events were happening inside a machine. The show was interested in the philosophy and not in the plot twist, and the theorists who understood that distinction produced more durable readings than the ones who treated the Plutonian cameo as a smoking gun. The simulation question ultimately connects to something the show kept circling from its earliest episodes, the relationship between constructed and authentic experience. If Roy can live a full human life in an arcade game and grieve its ending, if a simulated Diane can carry the weight of Rick's love, if a cloned Beth can be indistinguishable from the original, down to her memories and her doubts, then the distinction between real and simulated collapses in the direction the simulation theorists feared, but for reasons more interesting than a nested alien deception. The show's answer to the simulation question was never that the events were fake, but that the fakeness or realness of an event is less important than what it costs and what it means, which is a more uncomfortable conclusion than any Zagarian trap could produce. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The simulation theories showed a fandom wrestling with the show's deepest philosophical question, the reliability of any given reality, and finding that the most honest answer was more unsettling than any specific theory could contain. Next, the focus turns to the question that has divided the audience since the 4th season finale, which Beth is real, what the show has and has not said about it, and why the answer might matter less than the asking. Section 7. The Beth clone question. There is a moment near the end of the 3rd season episode, The ABCs of Beth, where Rick offers his daughter something no parent has ever genuinely been able to offer a child, a way out that costs nothing and leaves no one behind. He tells her he can make a clone with all her memories, a copy so complete it will not know it is a copy, and that the clone will stay and live her life while she goes wherever she wants. Beth stands in the garage looking at her father and says she knows what she wants to do, and the episode ends. The screen goes dark. The show does not tell the audience what she decided, and it would wait a full season before returning to the question. When it did return, in the 4th season finale Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, it confirmed that a clone had been made, and then announced that even Rick no longer knew which Beth was which, because he had scrambled the vats and then wiped his own memory of the scrambling. The most precise mind in the multiverse had gone to specific lengths to make the question unanswerable, and the show passed that unanswerable question directly to the audience. The fan community had been theorizing about the clone since the end of the 3rd season, which gave the debate over a year to develop before the 4th season finale complicated it further. The early theories split along two lines that reflected two different ways of reading what Beth's character needed. One school held that the Beth who stayed home was the clone, meaning the Beth the audience had followed for most of the series was the copy, and the woman who went to space was the original, pursuing the adventurous life she had always wanted under her own power. The other school held the reverse, that Space Beth was the clone created to give Beth the adventure she wanted while her real self remained at home with the family and the horses and the life she had actually built. Both positions had genuine textual support, and neither had enough to be decisive, which was precisely how the show had arranged things. The argument for Space Beth being the original centered on character logic. Beth's conversation with Rick in the ABCs of Beth was built around her desire for more, for the kind of life her intelligence and her courage deserved, for an escape from the domestic constraints she had organized herself around for years. If the clone's function was to live the life Beth was leaving behind, then the Beth who left was the real one, the one who made the choice, and the clone inherited the situation rather than the agency. Space Beth's arc across the 4th and 5th seasons, her competence, her confidence, her apparent comfort with danger and adventure, looked like the expression of the real Beth finally living on her own terms, rather than a copy performing a role. The argument for Earth Beth being the original was subtler and depended less on character logic than on narrative logic. Rick's stated reason for scrambling the vats was that he did not want to know which daughter was which, and his stated reason for that was some combination of philosophical indifference to the distinction and a characteristically avoidant unwillingness to carry the weight of having chosen. But the theory held that Rick was not as indifferent as he claimed, that on some level he had scrambled the vats specifically so that the Beth he interacted with every day could not be confirmed as the copy, which would mean he was protecting himself from knowing that the daughter he kept close was not the original. This reading made Rick's action less like nihilism and more like a specific emotional maneuver, a way of maintaining the comfort of the relationship without the guilt of knowing he had chosen convenience over reality. The detail that complicated everything and gave one side of the argument what looked like an external confirmation was a mobile game called Pocket Mortys, an officially licensed title connected to the show's creative team. Following the 4th season finale, the game updated to include a new character labeled Beth's clone, and the character depicted was Space Beth, the one in the distinctive haircut and battle armor. The Pocket Mortys designation seemed to confirm that Space Beth was the copy and Earth Beth was the real one, which would make the narrative of Space Beth's adventures the story of a constructed person finding a life she was not designed to have, a clone outgrowing her function. This was its own kind of interesting story, arguably more interesting than Space Beth simply being the real Beth doing what she always wanted, and a section of the fandom accepted the game's labeling as the closest thing available to a definitive answer. The problem with treating the game as canon was that the show's own creators had declined to make it canon. Dan Harmon's comments in the behind-the-scenes materials following the 4th season finale suggested that his own instinct leaned towards Space Beth being the clone, which aligned with the Pocket Mortys labeling, but he framed his preference as a personal feeling about the story rather than a settled fact about the text. The show itself had made the choice deliberately unanswerable within its own narrative, and no ancillary material had the authority to override that deliberateness. The Pocket Mortys label was a data point rather than a confirmation, and the theorists who treated it as the final word were importing certainty from a source the show had not granted that authority. The visual detail that the fandom examined most obsessively in the absence of a definitive answer was Space Beth's single strand of blue hair, a styling choice that distinguished her from Earth Beth and that the theory community parsed for weeks after the 4th season finale. The blue highlight connected, for some theorists, to a running visual motif in Dan Harmon's other work, specifically the character Evil Britta from a Community episode who bore a similar distinguishing mark. And the reading was that the blue strand was a deliberate signal from Harmon that Space Beth was the evil or aberrant or constructed version of the two, the one that had grown beyond her intended parameters. Other theorists dismissed this as an overreach, arguing that the blue strand was simply a character design choice to help the audience visually distinguish two physically identical characters, a production necessity rather than a narrative statement. The show never clarified which reading was correct, which meant both remained in circulation simultaneously, feeding the broader uncertainty rather than resolving it. What made the Beth clone question genuinely different from most Rick and Morty fan theories was that it was not a mystery with a hidden correct answer waiting to be discovered. The Evil Morty origin question had a correct answer that the show was building toward and eventually delivered. The Central Finite Curve had a correct answer that the show confirmed in explicit terms. The Beth clone question was designed from the start to be permanently open, not because the writers had not decided, but because the show's argument about identity required the question to remain unresolved. Rick's decision to scramble the vats was not a plot contrivance, producing a mystery to be solved later. It was a thematic statement about the nature of the distinction the question was asking about, the suggestion that the difference between an original person and a complete copy of that person, down to every memory and every uncertainty and every fear, might not be a difference that matters in any morally significant way. This is where the fan theory culture around the Beth clone diverged most sharply from the show's actual concerns. The fandom wanted an answer because fan theory culture is built around the premise that there are answers, that the show knows what is true, and the audience's job is to figure it out. The Beth clone storyline was structured around the opposite premise, that the show was not withholding an answer, but genuinely proposing that the answer was not available because the category the question depended on was not stable. Whether Space Beth Beth is original or copy is a question that assumes originality and copiness are fundamentally different conditions, and the show kept testing that assumption from the moment Rick first proposed the clone in the ABCs of Beth. His pitch to Beth included the observation that the clone would love her children with the same authenticity she would, not a simulation of love, but love itself, because a complete enough copy of a person is not a copy of love, but love running in a different substrate. The 5th season episode, Bethic Twinstinct, brought both versions of Beth together in a storyline that was partly comedy and partly a serious examination of what it means to encounter a complete version of yourself, and the episode was careful to give both Beths equivalent interiority, equivalent uncertainty, and equivalent claim on the audience's investment. Neither version was written as the real one, and neither as the echo. Both women felt the same confusion, the same pull toward each other, the same discomfort with the impossibility of their situation. The show used the sustained presence of both Beths to demonstrate its thesis more thoroughly than any single revelation could have, which was that the question of which one was original had become less important than the question of what each of them was doing with the life they had, and that the two answers to that question were different enough to make both lives worth having, regardless of which substrate they ran on. The theory community's response to Bethic Twinstinct was itself revealing. Rather than accepting the episode as a statement about the irrelevance of the original versus clone distinction, a significant portion of the fandom mined it for new evidence, scrutinizing the behavior of both Beths for tells that might reveal which one was the real one. The episode gave them nothing definitive to work with because it had been written specifically to deny that kind of reading, and the frustration this produced in some corners of the fandom was a precise illustration of the show's broader argument about intelligence used in the service of finding answers rather than sitting with questions. The theorists who kept looking for the tell were Rick's children in the most unflattering sense, using close reading as a mechanism for avoiding the discomfort of genuine uncertainty. The darker reading of Rick's scrambling, which a minority of theorists developed and which the show itself hints at without confirming, concerned what it meant that Rick could do such a thing at all. A man who clones his daughter and then deliberately removes his own ability to know which version is standing in front of him has not resolved a moral problem. He has engineered a situation in which the moral problem cannot be felt, in which the question of whether he is relating to his actual daughter or a constructed version of her can never arise because he has made the distinction inaccessible to himself. The scrambling looks like a generous gesture, an act of philosophical humility, a man who cannot bear to privilege one version of his daughter over the other. The darker reading is that it is his most characteristic move, the inventor tier, deployed in service of emotional avoidance, a technical solution to the problem of having to feel the weight of what he had done. This reading connects the Beth clone question to the show's broadest argument about Rick, which is that his intelligence is most consistently used to manufacture distance from consequences rather than to engage with them. He cannot grieve Diane, so he builds a hologram. He cannot choose between his daughters, so he scrambles the vats. He cannot sit in the garage without moving, so he portals to the next adventure. The Beth clone is one more object in a long catalog of brilliant technical solutions to problems that were asking for a human response, and the show treats the technical solution with the same ambivalence it treats all the others, acknowledging its elegance while quietly registering its cost. The 6th season added a dimension to the clone question that the earlier seasons had left unexplored, through the arc involving Space Beth's growing presence in the family's daily life and her complicated relationship with Earth Beth, Jerry, and the children. Space Beth's integration into the Smith household was handled with enough care that the show seemed to be arguing for the possibility of a family that contained more than one version of the same person, without requiring either version to be sacrificed or subordinated. Both Beths occupied the same family simultaneously, brought different things to it, and found in each other a relationship the show treated as genuine and earned rather than philosophically problematic. The message, delivered quietly across several episodes rather than in any single revelatory moment, was that the family had absorbed the impossible situation and found a way to live inside it, which was more interesting and more honest than a revelation about which Beth was real would have been. The fan theory community processed this development with characteristic thoroughness and characteristic resistance. Some theorists took the 6th season's handling of Space Beth as confirmation that the show had decided the question of authenticity was permanently off the table, that it had moved past the clone mystery entirely and was simply writing both Beths as full characters with equal narrative standing. Others argued that the very comfort with which both Beths occupied the family was itself a tell, that the ease of their coexistence suggested the show had internally resolved the question of which one was real and was simply not announcing the resolution, allowing the answer to live in the subtext while the text maintained its official position of uncertainty. The Beth clone question will likely remain open for as long as the show continues, because resolving it would require the show to commit to a position it has deliberately refused, that there is a meaningful difference between the two Beths that the audience should care about. What it has committed to instead is the proposition that both women are fully real, that their experiences and relationships and fears are equally valid, and that a clone who has lived a life is not less of a person than the original who made the decision to create her. This is a more interesting and more uncomfortable position than either side of the fan theory debate was arguing for, and it is the one the show has been building toward since Rick made his offer in the garage and the screen went dark. The clone question's deepest contribution to the show's mythology is not any answer it eventually produces, but the way it reframes every other identity question the series raises. Once the audience has accepted, or been forced to accept, that the distinction between Beth and her clone is philosophically unstable, the same instability applies to every other doubled character the show has created. The distinction between Rick C-137 and the Rick of any other dimension becomes harder to hold with confidence. The distinction between the Morty who buries himself in a backyard and the Morty who lives on in the borrowed reality is easier to see as contingent. The show uses the Beth clone not just as a mystery about one character, but as a wedge that loosens the entire concept of individual identity within its own fictional world. And the fan theories that tried to close the question by finding the real Beth were missing the most interesting thing the question was doing, which was making the concept of a real Beth progressively harder to sustain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Beth clone question showed a fandom expecting an answer from a show that had decided the question itself was the point, and a creator who used the mystery to say something harder than any resolution could have. Next, the focus turns to the theories that reached for time travel as a solution to the show's deepest puzzles, why the creators resisted the device, and what the fan arguments about Rick Prime and a future version of Morty revealed about what the show was and was not willing to do. Section 8. The Time Travel Theories. Of all the structural tools available to a science fiction story, time travel is the one Rick and Morty has most consistently refused to use seriously, and that refusal is itself one of the most theorized facts about the show. Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland stated early and often that they found time travel as a narrative device limiting and unsatisfying, that it tended to drain tension from stories by offering an exit from every consequence, and that they preferred the multiverse model precisely because it generated consequence without requiring the characters to undo it. Rick can portal to a new reality, but he cannot go back and unmake the old one, which is a meaningful distinction, and the show built much of its emotional weight on that distinction. The refusal to use time travel was not a casual aesthetic preference, but a structural commitment, one that shaped the entire mythology of the series, and one the fandom spent years trying to find exceptions to. The fandom treated this refusal as a provocation almost from the start. A show that kept insisting it would not use a device was, in some readings, a show that kept thinking about that device, and the fan community responded by building some of its most elaborate theories around the exact mechanism the creators had said they did not want to use. The time travel theories were not the most accurate the fandom produced, but they were among the most inventive, and the questions they raised about identity, causation, and the shape of Rick's story were questions the show was working through by other means, even when it declined to answer them in the way the theories proposed. The garage box, labeled time travel stuff, was the show's most transparent acknowledgement of this dynamic, a prop that said plainly that the technology existed and that Rick had chosen not to use it, an invitation to ask why that was never formally accepted and never formally declined. The oldest and most persistent time travel theory about the show held that Rick and Morty were the same person at different points in a single timeline, that Morty grew up to become Rick through a loop of causation that the show was building toward as its ultimate revelation. The evidence assembled for this reading was genuinely interesting and carefully compiled. Both characters share a stutter, a detail so specific to each individual actor's performance that its presence in both suggests deliberate writing rather than coincidence. Their head shapes, in the show's simplified character design, are visually similar in ways that other character pairings are not. Rick's deep investment in Morty, which the show frames as exploitation, but which keeps producing moments of genuine tenderness and protectiveness, could be read as the investment of a person in a version of themselves, an older man trying to steer a younger version away from the path that produced his own bitterness without being able to say why directly. The theory was appealing because it gave the show's central relationship an additional layer of tragic meaning, transforming the grandfather-grandson dynamic into something stranger and more self-enclosed, a man trapped in a loop with himself, unable to warn his younger version effectively because the warning would require him to acknowledge both what he was and what the boy would become. It also gave Rick's nihilism a temporal explanation that was, in its own way, more compassionate than the standard reading. The bitterness would not simply be the product of loss and isolation. It would be the bitterness of a man who had seen where the road led and could not detour around it, who had tried to intervene in his own formation and failed, who understood with the particular exhaustion of someone who had already lived through everything that the outcome was not going to change, regardless of how hard he tried. The creators dismissed this theory more directly than than they dismissed most, stating explicitly in multiple forums that they had no interest in using time travel as a plot device, and that the Morty becomes Rick reading would require exactly the kind of causal loop they found narratively unproductive. The show's confirmed backstory in the 6th season went further by establishing Rick's distinct biological history in enough detail to make separate genetic lineages essentially undeniable, because a Morty who became Rick would need to share Rick's bloodline with himself, and the mythology the show had built made that circular genealogy impossible to sustain. The theory did not survive contact with the show's own confirmed lore, but it lasted long enough and attracted enough serious attention that its collapse felt like a genuine loss to the portion of the fandom that had invested in it, a story the show could have told but had decided not to. What the Morty becomes Rick theory revealed about the fandom was something worth noting. The viewers who built it were not simply guessing at plot mechanics. They were trying to find an explanation for the emotional texture of the Rick and Morty relationship that was proportionate to the intensity of that relationship as depicted. The show kept showing them a grandfather who behaved like someone with a deeply personal stake in a specific boy's development, who could be moved by Morty in ways that no other character consistently managed, and who treated Morty's growth with a particular combination of pride and anxiety that looked less like exploitation and more like recognition. The Morty becomes Rick theory was an attempt to explain that intensity through structure, to find a narrative mechanism that would make Rick's investment in Morty feel as earned and as loaded as it clearly was. That the show eventually provided a different and more painful explanation for that investment through the confirmed backstory of Rick's lost family and the grief that organized his whole existence did not invalidate the question the theory was asking. It just answered it differently. A more structurally interesting and more durable time travel theory concerned not Morty but Rick Prime, the version of Rick responsible for killing Diane and the young Beth in C-137, and the question of how he had evaded capture for so long. Rick C-137, the smartest Rick in the Central Finite Curve by the show's own accounting, spent decades hunting his counterpart across the multiverse and consistently failed to close the gap. Rick Prime always seemed to be a step ahead, always seemed to know what was coming, always managed to be somewhere other than where the hunt expected him to be. The fan theory circulating through the later seasons offered a clean explanation for this pattern, which was that Rick Prime was not simply smarter than Rick C-137 at the specific game of evasion, but was operating with a fundamentally different informational advantage, specifically that he was a time traveler, and Rick C-137, bound by his own stated refusal to use the device, could not anticipate moves made from outside the present moment. The mechanics of this theory were carefully developed by its proponents. The box in Rick's garage labeled time travel stuff became central to the argument because it demonstrated that Rick possessed the technology and had made a specific decision not to use it. If the decision were simply aesthetic, a preference for multiversal mechanics over temporal ones, the box would be less interesting than it was. But if Rick had banned himself from time travel because he had identified it as Rick Prime's advantage, and because using it himself would mean playing on a board where his opponent had years of experience and he had none, then the box became a much more loaded object. It was not the discard pile of an uninterested engineer, it was the deliberate self-limitation of a man who had diagnosed his own tactical disadvantage and chosen to compete on different ground rather than cede the temporal domain to a superior practitioner. A darker variant of this reading proposed that Rick's refusal to use time travel was driven not by tactical calculation, but by a specific fear, the fear that Rick Prime might actually be Rick C-137 from the future. If the causation ran that way, if the Rick who bombed the garage and killed Diane was a future version of the Rick who lost everything in that bombing, then the hunt was not a manhunt across the multiverse, but a man trying to locate and destroy his own future self, which would explain both the difficulty of the search and the psychological impossibility of completing it cleanly. A man hunting himself would keep pulling his punches without knowing it, misreading his own tactical patterns as his quarry's superior intelligence, and would have every reason to avoid a technology that might confirm what he most feared about the shape of his own story. This variant was the most emotionally resonant of the time travel theories because it made Rick's decades-long failure proportionate to the nature of the obstacle in a way that a simple superiority explanation did not quite manage. A Rick who could not catch Rick Prime because Rick Prime was simply smarter was a story about losing to a better opponent, which was interesting but not devastating. A Rick who could not catch Rick Prime because Rick Prime was himself was a future he was both hunting and becoming, was a story about a man trapped inside his own causation, which was the kind of tragedy the show kept building toward across its best seasons. The theory was wrong in its specifics, as the 7th season confirmed by staging a confrontation between two genuinely distinct individuals with no temporal dimension to their relationship, but it was right in its emotional logic, because the show's actual explanation for Rick's failure to close the gap faster, that grief made him a less efficient hunter, and love made him a less ruthless one, was its own version of the same idea, a man undone by his relationship to himself rather than by an opponent's superior capability. The Season 7 episode Unmortricken Bacon partially addressed the time travel theories by delivering the Rick Prime confrontation and framing it unambiguously as a meeting between genuinely distinct individuals with separate histories and separate motivations. Rick Prime did not behave like a man facing a future version of himself. He behaved like a man who had made a philosophical choice early in his life, the choice to cut away every attachment and every vulnerability, and who found the Rick in front of him pitiable rather than familiar, a version of himself who had made the weaker choice and paid for it with decades of grief and obsession. The time travel dimension to their relationship was not confirmed, and the show's treatment of the moment suggested the theory was not the architecture the writers had built toward. What the time travel theories ultimately could not overcome was the show's own structural commitment to consequence, which was the deepest feature of the series and the one the theory culture found hardest to account for. Rick and Morty was built on the premise that choices produced outcomes that could not be undone, only abandoned and replaced, and that the weight of those outcomes was where the show's emotional power lived. Time travel as a serious plot mechanism would have eroded exactly that foundation, offering an exit from every consequence and making every loss provisional. The creators' resistance to the device was not simply an aesthetic preference. It was a defense of the show's emotional architecture, and the fans who kept finding ways to introduce time travel into the mythology were, in a specific sense, trying to build themselves a door out of a story that had been deliberately constructed without exits. The show's refusal to provide that door was its own argument about what the story was for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The time travel theories showed a fandom searching for an explanation proportionate to Rick's intelligence for why the hunt took so long, and finding that the show's real answer was less mechanical and more painful than any temporal loop could account for. Next, the focus turns to the darkest readings the fandom produced, the theories about Rick's origins that assumed the worst and, in several cases, turned out to be right. Section 9. The darker origin readings. Some fan theories about Rick and Morty were built to explain plot mechanics, to account for a ticket number, or a dimensional designation, or a prop that appears in the wrong episode. The theories in this section were built for a different purpose. They were built to account for the shape of a person, to explain why a man with every resource and every exit available to him had arrived at the specific configuration of damage the show kept depicting. The darkest fan readings of Rick's origin were not puzzle solutions. They were attempts to understand how someone becomes the way Rick is, and in several cases they landed closer to the truth than the show had yet confirmed, because the truth the show was building toward was itself a dark one. The theory that Rick C-137 had an original Morty before the series began connects directly to the darker origin readings because its most troubling variant concerned not just who the original Morty was, but what Rick did to him. The mild version held that Rick had grown close to an earlier Morty and then walked away, the same avoidant move he performed with everyone. The darker version held that Rick had not simply walked away, but had actively removed the original Morty from his life when that Morty became too intelligent, too capable, too much of a threat to the arrangement that kept Rick at the top. This version made Rick not merely neglectful but actively predatory toward the child he had raised, and it transformed the show's central relationship into something more troubling than a portrait of a flawed mentor. It made Rick a man who had, at least once, treated a grandson as a threat to be neutralized rather than a person to be protected. The evidence the fandom marshaled for this reading was circumstantial but pointed in a consistent direction. The baby Morty memory that should not exist given Rick's stated 20-year absence from Beth's family implied not only that Rick had known a Morty before the series began, but that he had been emotionally invested in that Morty in ways that left residue strong enough to surface under a memory scan decades later. A man who simply used a Morty as camouflage and moved on would not necessarily retain a tearful memory of that child's infancy. The emotional content of the memory suggested genuine attachment, and attachment in Rick's history tends to precede loss, because the pattern the show established was that Rick formed genuine bonds and then severed them, usually through flight rather than confrontation. The darker reading asked, what would happen if the flight had not been enough, if the Morty he left behind had refused to stay left, and if the intelligence that made walking away necessary had also made the abandoned child capable of engineering a return. The show's own pilot supported the darker reading in ways that required attention to notice. Rick's stated reason for needing the Megatree seeds was scientific, but his urgency around them was personal, and his willingness to use Morty as a mule for the smuggling operation was immediate and unquestioning. A man who had previously raised a Morty, whose intelligence grew dangerous, would have specific reasons to monitor the intelligence-enhancing properties of those seeds, reasons he would not be able to explain to the new Morty without revealing the history he was concealing. The pilot's adventure, the mission that established the terms of Rick and Morty's relationship from the very first episode, carried a different weight under the darker origin reading. A man managing a supply chain connected to the very capability that had made his previous relationship with a Morty end badly. The theory of the original Rick's absence is a separate and stranger reading that developed partly independently independently of the evil Morty hypothesis. This theory, which circulated in various forms across online communities, held that the Rick who originally inhabited the dimension where the show is primarily set had disappeared from Beth's life not simply through the wandering instability the show cited, but through something more final. The theory pointed to a specific moment in the show as its evidence, the sequence in Rick Potion number 9, where Rick and Morty discover their own dead bodies in the alternate dimension they are about to inhabit, and noted that Rick's response to discovering his own corpse was strikingly practiced. He knew exactly what to do. He moved through the process of burying himself and assuming the dead Rick's place with a fluency that suggested prior experience rather than improvisation, as though he had performed some version of this procedure before, stepping into a vacancy left by another version of himself and building a life in the space the absence had created. The theory proposed that the Rick the audience follows throughout the series had done exactly this before arriving at Beth's doorstep, that he had located a dimension whose own Rick had departed, slipped into the empty space, and presented himself to a Beth who had no reason to question whether the father returning after 20 years was the same father who had originally left. This would explain the specific quality of Beth's relationship with her returned father, the combination of desperate need and ambient unease, the sense that she was always auditioning for his approval in ways that suggested she had never quite trusted that the approval was hers to have. If the Rick in front of her was not the Rick who left, the emotional logic of her insecurity would have a literal foundation, the intuition of someone dealing with a person who was almost the right person but carried the slightest wrong frequency. The show's confirmed backstory complicated but did not fully extinguish this reading. The revelation that Rick C-137's biological Beth was killed as a child by Rick Prime meant that the Beth in the series was never his biological daughter, that his arrival at the home dimension was always a form of occupying another Rick's abandoned life, which is structurally similar to what the darker theory proposed. The confirmed version removed the specific mechanism of a home dimension Rick disappearing and replaced it with the more elaborated story of Rick C-137 choosing to inhabit Rick Prime's abandoned dimension as a staging ground for his manhunt. The emotional architecture of the darker theory survived the correction even as its mechanics were revised, because the show confirmed that the Rick the audience knows had always been living in a life that was not originally his, filling a space left by a different kind of absence, doing something that resembled belonging without quite being it. The darkest readings the fandom produced about Rick's interior life concerned not his history with Morty's or his dimensional origins, but the drinking, and what the drinking was covering, and what happened when the covering failed. A theory that circulated in the seasons following autoerotic assimilation argued that the near miss the garage scene depicted was not an isolated incident, but the most recently visible instance of a pattern, and that Rick's construction of a life organized around constant motion, constant danger, and constant chemical maintenance was partly a response to earlier failures to find a quieter exit. The theory held that Rick's willingness to court extreme danger across the show's adventures was not purely nihilism and not purely the survivor's reflex that had kept him alive across countless impossible situations. On this reading, it was also something more deliberate, a man who had tried to stop and found the attempts unsuccessful, leaving every door to death open while keeping both hands on the frame, choosing a life where the possibility was ambient rather than chosen, where the end could arrive through adventure rather than through stillness. This reading connected to the show's own confirmed portrait of Rick in ways the theorists had largely intuited correctly before the confirmation arrived. The show established through its later seasons that Rick's adventuring life served multiple emotional functions simultaneously. It kept him moving fast enough that the grief could not find a clean landing. It provided external stakes that substituted for internal ones he could not access. It maintained a level of physical danger that made death a perpetual ambient possibility rather than a decision requiring intention. The darker origin reading was essentially accurate about the function of the danger in Rick's life, even if the show never confirmed that earlier attempts had occurred, because the function it identified was the one the show kept depicting through its entire run. The near miss in the garage was the most visible evidence of something the show treated as endemic rather than exceptional. The theory that Rick built the Central Finite Curve, at least partly to trap Rick Prime, developed most fully in the lore that Rick Mirai Jack confirmed, had its own darker fan variant that the confirmation partially supported. Before the Season 5 finale explained the curve's origin, some theorists argued that it had been built not primarily as a hunting tool or as a vanity project, but as a form of containment, a way for Rick C-137 to wall off the realities he most needed to protect from a Rick who had demonstrated willingness to destroy everything he loved. The protection reading of the curve's origin sat alongside the vanity reading rather than replacing it, because the show's confirmed backstory allowed both motivations to coexist. Rick helped build the curve to narrow the hunt, and he helped build it to guarantee his own supremacy, and he may have built it partly to create a region of the multiverse multiverse, where the specific kind of destruction Rick Prime had already enacted once was structurally harder to repeat. The darker theories that assumed Rick had at least some protective impulse underneath the self-serving ones were not wrong in their reading of his character, only incomplete in their accounting of his methods. The deepest contribution the darker origin readings made to the show's mythology was not any specific claim about what had happened to Rick before the series began, but the consistent argument that the show was depicting a man shaped by events the audience was not yet seeing, that the damage on display was proportionate to a history of loss that ran deeper than any single confirmed tragedy could account for. The fandom assembled this portrait from fragments, from the baby Morty memory and the practiced ease of the body burial and the near miss in the garage and the decades spent organizing an entire life around a single target, and the portrait they assembled was accurate in its emotional shape, even when specific details were wrong. The show's confirmed mythology, delivered across the 5th, 6th, and 7th seasons, filled in the blanks with events that matched the scale of damage the darker theories had always insisted must be there. What all the darker origin theories share, beyond their specific claims, is a willingness to take the damage seriously, rather than treating it as character color. The fandom that produced these readings was paying attention to what the show was saying about the long-term effects of loss on a particular kind of mind, a mind powerful enough to build almost any defense and therefore, when the defenses were inadequate, exposed to a depth of pain proportionate to the height of the walls. The darker origin readings understood that the show was not primarily a comedy about an eccentric genius, but a portrait of grief extended across decades and expressed in the only language available to a man who had made himself incapable of speaking it directly. The confirmed mythology validated this understanding more than it invalidated it, arriving at the same emotional truth the darker theories had been circling, which was that the smartest man in the universe had organized his entire existence around a wound he refused to name, and that the organization was elaborate enough to look, from the outside, like a life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The darker origin readings showed a fandom willing to follow the show's emotional architecture to its bleakest implications, and finding that the show had arrived there too. Next, the final section draws the whole picture together, examining what the conspiracy theory culture around Rick and Morty reveals about the show's design, about its audience, and about why a piece of fiction that kept its best secrets in plain sight produced the most sustained and accurate fan analysis in contemporary animation. Section 10. What the theories reveal. Step back far enough from any individual theory, from the ticket number and the flask and the yellow portal and the baby Morty memory, and a larger pattern comes into focus. The fan conspiracy culture that grew up around Rick and Morty was not simply an enthusiastic audience guessing at plot points. It was a sustained collective act of reading, a community of viewers who treated a piece of popular animation with the kind of close interpretive attention usually reserved for literary fiction, and who were rewarded for that attention with a degree of accuracy that the history of fan theorizing around television had rarely seen before. Understanding why the theories worked as well as they did, and what the ones that failed were missing, reveals something important not just about the show, but about what kind of object it was, and what its makers were trying to build. The first and most important thing the theory culture reveals is that Rick and Morty was designed to be read at 2 speeds simultaneously. The surface speed was fast, chaotic, joke-dense, self-interrupting, the rhythm of a show that wanted to be watched casually and enjoyed without any obligation to keep track. The deeper speed was slow, deliberate, and architecturally precise, the rhythm of a show building a mythology across years with enough internal consistency that a careful reader could follow the load-bearing structure beneath the comedy. Most television operates at one speed or the other. The shows that generate sustained, accurate fan theory culture are almost always the ones that operate at both, because the gap between the speeds is where the theories live. The audience that moves at the surface speed has a good time and misses the structure. The audience that moves at the deep speed sometimes misses the fun, but finds the blueprint, and the blueprint in this case was genuinely there to be found. The blueprint was not complete from the start, which is the second thing the theory culture reveals. Rick and Morty was not a show whose entire mythology was planned in a writer's room before the first episode aired, and then systematically executed across 8 seasons. It was a show whose mythology developed in response to what worked, what resonated, what the audience grabbed onto, and what the writers themselves found most interesting to explore as the run continued. Dan Harmon's structural discipline gave the show a consistent shape at the level of individual episodes and seasonal arcs, but the long mythology, the Central Finite Curve, the Rick Prime backstory, the full Evil Morty arc, grew organically over years rather than springing from a complete master document. This means that the fan theories were not simply decoding a finished text, but participating in something more dynamic, a conversation between an audience and a creative team, in which the audience's most attentive readings sometimes fed back into the text itself. The evidence for this feedback loop is partly circumstantial and partly direct. Several writers and producers associated with the show acknowledged awareness of of fan theories in interviews and panel appearances, and the show's later seasons contained details that seemed calibrated specifically for the portion of the audience that had been paying the closest attention. Details that would be invisible to a casual viewer, but would land with specific precision for someone who had followed the theory discourse. Whether those details were planted as rewards for the attentive audience, or simply reflected the writer's own growing sophistication about the mythology they were building, is impossible to determine from the outside, but the effect was the same either way, a show that seemed to be in dialogue with its own most careful readers. The theories that proved most accurate were the ones that understood the show's emotional architecture rather than simply its plot mechanics. The Evil Morty theory that held up was not the one built on the specific identity claim that Evil Morty was definitively the original Morty of Rick C-137, but the one built on the emotional logic that a Morty who understood what he was would eventually refuse to remain it. The Central Finite Curve theory held up not because the theorists had access to information no one else had, but because they followed the emotional implication of the show's own premise to its honest conclusion, that a man who used intelligence to avoid feeling anything would eventually use intelligence to build a structure that made avoidance permanent. The theories that understood what the show was about at the level of character and feeling were consistently more accurate than the theories that treated the show as a puzzle of facts and tried to solve it through information alone. This distinction explains why the simulation theories, the most structurally elegant of the failed readings, did not survive contact with the show's ongoing narrative. The simulation hypothesis was built on a piece of evidence, the Plutonian cameo, and a structural logic, nested simulations as a metaphor for constructed reality, but it did not engage with the show's emotional core in a way that the narrative supported. The show was not interested in the revelation that everything had been fake. It was interested in the question of what makes something feel real to a person who has been trained by grief and nihilism to treat nothing as permanent. Those are related questions, but they are not the same question, and the simulation theory answered the one the show was not asking. The Morty becomes Rick time travel theory failed for a similar reason. It was built on surface resemblances, the stutter, the head shape, the similar nihilism, and on a structural conceit, the causal loop, that the show's creators had explicitly said they did not want to use. But underneath those problems, it failed most fundamentally, because it misread the emotional relationship between Rick and Morty. The show was not building toward the revelation that they were the same person at different points in time. It was building towards something harder and more interesting, the possibility that a younger person who had been used and damaged by an older one could, over time, become something other than a repetition of that damage. Morty's arc across the series is not a countdown to becoming Rick. It is a slow and incomplete and sometimes terrifying negotiation with the question of whether he has to. The theory culture also reveals something about the particular audience Rick and Morty assembled and what that audience needed from the show. The community of close readers who produced the major theories was drawn disproportionately from people who identified with the experience of being intelligent in a way that felt like both an advantage and an isolation. People for whom the show's portrait of Rick resonated not as caricature, but as recognition. The theories these viewers built were often, at some level, theories about whether intelligence protected a person from the worst things, or simply allowed them to construct more elaborate versions of the same damage everyone was capable of. The Evil Morty theories asked what a brilliant mind does when it refuses to stay subordinate. The Flask theories asked whether the intelligence was earned or purchased, and what the maintenance cost. The simulation theories asked whether the smartest person in the room could still be trapped in a fiction he had not chosen. These were not questions about a television show. They were questions about a way of being in the world, and the fan theory culture was a vehicle for exploring them through the safe distance of fiction. The show understood this, and the best evidence of that understanding is the way it kept refusing to let intelligence be the solution to anything important. Rick's intelligence could build a universe and could not grieve his wife. It could escape any prison and could not stay in any room with the people who needed him to. It could theorize about the structure of reality and could not translate that theory into a way of living that produced anything other than loneliness and the occasional borrowed afternoon of connection. The fan community that built theories about the show was, in its own way, performing the same move the show kept criticizing, using careful reasoning as a substitute for sitting with the emotional content, finding in the analysis a comfort that the feeling itself might not have provided. This is not a criticism of the theorists. It is an observation about what the show was doing with the culture it cultivated. Rick and Morty built an audience of close readers and then spent its best episodes asking those close readers whether all that reading was actually helping them, whether the intelligence they were applying to the text was getting them closer to something true, or was, like Rick's own intelligence, a sophisticated way of staying at a comfortable distance from the thing that mattered. Dr. Wong's line about using intelligence to justify sickness was aimed at the show's own viewership as much as at the characters on screen, and the fans who heard it and felt briefly implicated before returning to their theories were experiencing exactly the discomfort the show intended. The conspiracy theories that proved most durable were the ones built not on a desire to be right, but on a genuine curiosity about the show's interior logic, the ones that followed a question because it was interesting, rather than because answering it would feel like winning. The ticket theory was that kind of theory, a small observation about a prop number that opened into a genuine philosophical question about identity and continuity in a multiverse. The Central Finite Curve theory was that kind of theory, a structural inference from a throwaway phrase that turned out to describe something the show had been building all along. These theories were not primarily interested in proving themselves, they were interested in understanding something, and the understanding they arrived at was real and useful for watching the show more honestly, regardless of whether every specific detail was confirmed. The theories that aged worst were the ones built around the desire for a reveal, a gotcha moment where everything snapped into place, and the smartest readers were vindicated. The Morty is Rick theory had that shape, built toward a twist rather than toward understanding. The simulation theory had that shape, building toward the revelation that everything was fake rather than toward what fake and real meant in the context the show was exploring. The show's own structure punished these theories not by proving them wrong through a competing revelation, but by simply continuing to build a mythology in which the emotional truth was more complex and more sustainable than any single twist could contain. The final thing the theory culture reveals is something about the show's relationship with its own most attentive audience, a relationship that was genuinely unusual in contemporary television. Rick and Morty was a show that respected its viewers enough to hide real things in plain sight and trust that someone would find them, that planted genuine evidence for genuine conclusions, and waited years for the audience to catch up. This is a different kind of respect from the kind that produces fan service, or gratuitous callbacks, or reward mechanics designed to make viewers feel clever. It is the respect of a work that takes its own ideas seriously and assumes the audience will too, that does not condescend by over-explaining, and does not patronize by pretending the surface is all there is. The theories that emerged from that respect were, at their best, a genuine contribution to the experience of watching the show, a way of making visible what the text was doing beneath its own comedy. The fan who first pulled the curve inference from a throwaway line in season 1 was not simply guessing, they were reading, and what they read was real, and the show eventually confirmed it was real by building the rest of the mythology around it. That kind of accuracy is rare in fan theory culture, and it does not happen by accident. It happens when a show is built with enough internal consistency that careful attention produces genuine insight rather than elaborate noise, and Rick and Morty, at its best, was exactly that kind of show. The theories are not over. The show continues, and the questions the later seasons have left open, the fate of evil Morty now that he holds the reconstructed knowledge of the Omega device, the long-term shape of Morty's arc as he grows steadily harder and more capable, the question of what Rick does with a life no longer organized around revenge, are already generating the next generation of close reading and careful inference. The community is still watching at 2 speeds simultaneously, still treating throwaway props as potential evidence, and background phrases as planted seeds. Some of what they find will be noise, some of it will be real. The show has earned enough trust from the people paying closest attention that the distinction is worth pursuing, and the theories that emerge from that pursuit, even the ones that are wrong, are a form of serious engagement with a piece of fiction that deserves it. The conspiracy theories around Rick and Morty are, in the end, a portrait of an unusual relationship between a show and its audience, one built on mutual intelligence, mutual respect, and the shared understanding that the most interesting things in the text were always the ones neither side was quite ready to say out loud.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.